to get that in your head until it becomes a little more second nature. But if I were to kind of trace this part here, here and there, that's all relaxation phase. And especially this part where my ventricles are filling, so there's my EDV value. But I also realize it's the amount of blood at the end of relaxation, but I can also think of it as the amount of blood right before I begin to do my isovolemic contraction. So how much blood is in here actually determines the force my ventricles will exert with that blood to try and get that AV valve to open. Oh, I'm sorry, the aortic valve to open. Well, getting the aortic valve open is this term here about afterload. So we got to break down this term here known as afterload. So what is afterload? You're going to define it as this, is the amount of force the left ventricle must create to open up the aortic valve. The amount of force the left ventricle must create to open up the aortic valve. They need bracket to overcome resistance. Bracket to overcome resistance. Now let's look at what that means. So if we draw a quick little diagram here of your heart, we'll just skip the chambers. Here comes the aorta. We're going to come down here, dotted line, this is where my aorta will actually be. This will be where my semilunar valve is. And then we'll have your brachiocephalic, right? And then you'll have your common carotid and your subclavian, kind of coming like this. We know the blood pressure is measured standard classic textbook of 120/80. It's in millimeters of mercury. And what I want you to realize is heart contracting, heart relaxing. Systole over diastole. Heart contracting for 120, heart relaxing. When the heart's not beating, the blood pressure apparently is 80. How come blood pressure is 80? Why doesn't it go down to 0? What it says is that there's 80 units of force pushing against the walls of your blood vessels and of your arteries. And they're exerting a force, and we're measuring that force as this. And that blood is also pushing back down on those semilunar valves. And those of you that had lab already saw those semilunar valves. Imagine them billowing out when blood goes up against them and making those doors puff open and sealing shut. So blood is pushing against this semilunar valve. So far, is this making sense? All right. Now, imagine that door as my aortic valve. It's a one-way valve, right? We're a ventricle. The outside hallway is my ascending aorta. I can't just will the door open. I can't blow on it because there's already resistance. There's the weight of the door, right? But we'll put Taz on the other side of the door. We picked on David the last time. And she's pushing in on the door, trying to keep me from leaving. Right? She's blood pressure. She's diastolic blood pressure, trying to come back into the ventricle. She's pushing down against that valve. I have to push. What do I need to do to get the door to open compared to her? I have to push harder than her, right? I have to overcome that resistance. That's what afterload is. The amount of force I have to create to pop open that door. And that pressure I'm creating is working against this blood pressure pushing down against that valve, trying to keep the valve closed. I want it to open, but they're trying to push it against me. When you look at this graph in your notes, you're going to go all the way back to here. That's what this is, right? There's my EDV value. I start to push against the door, having to figure out, well, how hard do I have to push? I keep pushing and pushing harder and harder until I finally open up the valve. Well, that process of building up force and force and force, because my pressure is increasing, is my isovolemic contraction. I finally push harder than Taz is, now I get to leave the room. And that's what afterload is. It's simply the resistance the left ventricle must overcome to open up your aortic valve. That resistance was due to your diastolic blood pressure and the fact that the blood's trying to go back into the ventricle and making those semilunar valves bulge out. And I got to push against those sealed valves. So far, okay? All right. So we go back to this idea of what is afterload. I know it's the resistance, but then what causes it to change? Well, if I make this number get bigger, so instead of 80, I make it 100. So now I have what's called hypertension, high blood pressure. Did the level of afterload increase? Yes. Yeah, so what made it go up was just an increase in diastolic blood pressure. An increase in blood pressure makes afterload increase.
Because that's the force that's going down.
Right, trying to push against those valves. And if it went to 60, then afterload got easier, got lower, right? So remember, afterload is just simply resistance. So if I look at it, how to do this? Let's do it this way. Blood pressure is responsible, at least the diastolic value of blood pressure, responsible for my level of afterload. Do not get afterload mixed up with preload. Preload was stretch, right? Due to EDD, due to volumes of blood. But afterload is a measure of resistance. It's a force, in a sense, that my muscles have to contract against to get the valve to open up. Now we got to look at how afterload changes stroke volume. Now we've already seen afterload once, and that's right here. Go all the way back to this. This is you normally. You guys have afterload, right? I mean, you have a diastolic pressure value. That means you have afterload. And normal, we could say, is 80 millimeters of mercury. And that's what we're looking at here. Our normal cardiac cycle with normal pressures. So what made the valve open up, right? That was becoming slightly greater than the resistance. So the valve opens up and I push the blood out. Well, what's going to happen if we increase that resistance? This is going to have to contract more forcibly, right? We're all good with that part? Okay. Now look at this graph. Can you in your imagination see that as I go from here, with the beginning of my ventricles contracting, and I watch the pressure in the ventricles get higher and higher and higher, that it actually takes some time to do this? It's not instantaneous. You can imagine time having to pass by? All right, so how long is a single cardiac contraction cycle? It's 800 milliseconds, right, or 0.8 of 1 second. That's a cardiac cycle. So if I start here, right, from here to there and back again is 800 milliseconds. I'm on a you guys know what a metronome is? Right? So I'm on a timer because the SA node's the boss. It's the pacemaker. Then it says every 800 milliseconds, get off your butt and contract your down ventricles. Okay, so I'm on a timer like an employer and an employee. My boss says every 800 milliseconds, push. Okay, what if afterload increases? What if I made point C right up there instead? Will it take more time? Yeah. Probably so. Where do I get the more time from? I'm on a boss that says every 800 milliseconds, get off your butt and get that damn door open. Well, you got to take it from somewhere, right? So there's an expression, robbing Paul to pay Peter. I have 3 phases to this. I don't want to prolong my cardiac cycle, which I could do, but that lowers my heart rate. So I can either take from the filling time, the time that allows the blood to go into the ventricles. I could play with the time used to build up the force to open up the valve, or I can take time away from my ejection phase. Well, if I take time away from building up force, I'm not going to be able to build up force. So that's an easy one to get rid of. So you tend to take time away from your ejection. So if I have less time to eject, what happens to stroke volume? It's going to go down, right? Because you have less time to pump it out. So when you get an increase in afterload, because you have an increase in resistance, it takes you more time to match that more resistance, you're going to get a decrease in stroke volume. Because you got to get the time from somewhere. You don't want to take it from the cardiac cycle because you have to keep it at 800 milliseconds. You have no choice. You must stay at this level. So what am I going to do to be able to, well, let's finish this part. So if stroke volume goes down, what happens to ESV?
Goes up.
So you got to think about what ESV is. Right? Things that influence ESV. We had preload. We had contractility. We're talking about afterload. And afterload is the blood pressure, right? My diastolic blood pressure. Increases of blood pressure cause it to change. So how does that affect stroke volume? If you have less pumped out, and you start with 135, and I pump less out, we do it in black circles, I guess. And here's my stroke volume. Pump it out, pump it out, pump it out. And then says, oh, dude, you got to stop. You're ready for the next cycle. What happened to my stroke volume? It went down. I still got to get back to here. But with less time to pump it out, your ESV value went up. It used to be 65. Now maybe it's 80 or 90. So you get an increase in afterload, stroke volume went down, that means there's more left over that you get to play with. We're just recycling that 135. So what happened to ESV when the stroke volume went down? It went up, right? Because you have more left over. Now this is what happens because of afterload. This is the problem. Increase in blood pressure led to an increase in afterload, which is that stupid resistance on the other side of that semilunar valve. I noticed that when I get an increase in that resistance, it takes my heart longer to build up enough force to get that valve to open up. In fact, it takes me a longer time to build up that more force. I take that time away from my actual ejection phase, so my stroke volume goes down, which means there's more left over at the end of that contraction. I always want to go back to 135, bless you. But the problem is, if I know that cardiac output is simply equal to heart rate times stroke volume, and if this goes down, nobody say anything out loud, if this goes down, I need this to stay the same, that this does not change. That goes down, and this has to stay the same. What has to happen to this? All right, now somebody say something. Right, you all got the increase in heart rate idea? Right? Because they're inverse. Well, that's one option. Or I could do this. I'm going to realize that the poor quality of blood leaving my heart, blah, blah, blah. I get a message to make my heart contract more forcibly. I don't have to take longer. I can keep the exact same time frame. I just get it harder to reach that level faster. So instead of applying one hand to the door, I push both hands, and I push really hard. I still got to the same level of resistance, but it takes me less time. So I'm hitting with more force. Does that idea make sense? More force means you reach afterload more quickly. Now, that's what the heart's going to do. It's going to go, well, bag this crap. I'm on a metronome. I'm on 800 millisecond timer. I can't afford to increase my heart rate because the rate isn't going to actually be very helpful. I'm going to increase the force of my contraction. I hit it harder to reach afterload more quickly. and problem solved. You're back to a normal cardiac cycle in terms of amount of blood and total cardiac output. But your doctor doesn't like that. He says, I don't want you to work hard, you need to work smarter. So he realizes the whole problem was due to an increase in blood pressure. Why don't I fix your high blood pressure, and that will lower the afterload value. The heart won't have to work nearly as hard to reach that level of afterload. That part makes sense? So what's he going to do? He's going to give you maybe a diuretic, which we'll learn about in the renal system. You pee more, your blood volume drops, blood pressure drops. Problem solved. Or he can give you a calcium channel blocker or an alpha blocker. He can make your blood vessels dilate. So in other words, he can manipulate your blood pressure to make it lower. If he can make your blood pressure lower, he makes your afterload lower. And if he lowers your afterload, he lowers the resistance. And if he lowers the resistance, he lowers how hard the heart has to work. And then you just go back to a normal pathway. Right? So afterload is a measurement of resistance. Right? It was your diastolic blood pressure. It's pushing against your semilunar valves. And my heart has to create enough force to open up those semilunar valves. And we use the word afterload to express all of that. Then you get preload, which is simply due to stretch of a chamber. And that was due to your EDD value, the amount of blood in that chamber before the ventricles or atria began to contract. And we know that EDD influences the amount of preload in those chambers. So what I'm hoping you'll be able to do is, A, you'll never have to reproduce this. But once you think you understand all the lecture notes, then follow through, and this makes a fair amount of sense. Right? Venous return. Right? More blood coming into the heart means more EDD. That makes complete sense. Less blood coming in means less EDD. And EDD affects preload. And preload, right, deals with end diastolic volume. If I have more EDD, which means more stretch, I get an increase in stroke volume because of the Frank-Starling principle. More blood coming in, more stretch means more force means a stronger contraction. It's got to work your way through this. Keep in mind that FT, where's FT? My filling time, right? You can replace it with the word heart rate. It's the same thing. Because filling time is heart rate. You should be able to walk through this maybe say by Saturday and go, all this makes sense. Right? There's your afterload. Right? The increase in afterload led to an increase, right, in ESV. You just need to understand why that's true, because it actually affected your stroke volume. This is where you're going to want to take this one slide at a time. Don't try and put it all together and make some gigantic, really scary case study. Right? Just one concept at a time. Learn the things that affect heart rate. Understand why they work. Right? The sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways. And realize that your cardiac reflex take advantage of that. They use that pathway either due to increase in blood pressure or increases or decreases in gas values. Then you have the atrial reflex, which is stretch of my atrial chamber due to venous return. That works directly with the sympathetic nervous system. But then your Frank-Starling, right, was about overlap of muscle cells and actin and myosin. No sympathetic nervous system, no neurotransmitters involved, no hormones involved. Things that influence EDD, heart rate, and then what afterload was. That's that resistance that I have to overcome to get the blood to leave my left ventricle and go into my aorta, and that resistance was due to your diastolic blood pressure. Pressure goes up, afterload goes up, afterload goes up, stroke volume goes down, and by consequence, my ESV goes down. One connection you guys tend to make that you don't want to make is that this led to that. Really, this is why I have this. Right? So keep that in mind. That this will influence that. That does not really influence this. This is the end result of that, and that was influenced by that. Big piece of cake. All right, so you guys in the lab, we get to eat things and cut things open.